podcast contains material that may or may not be considered appropriate for the average Trumptopian household.
Totally fucked up that opening, didn't I?
Listen at your own risk to unauthorized and explicit reading.
On today's show's Logos.
Disclaimer. All rights to literature referenced are retained by appropriate entities, and no infringement is intended. The reading of any and all literary materials referenced herein is done expressly for the altruistic purpose of genuinely facilitating the species-wide pineal gland activating, third eye opening, transcendent spiritual enlightenment of all of humanity. Any and all opinions expressed herein are exclusively those of the imaginary talk show host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And now, brace yourselves for unauthorized and explicit readings.
Hello and namaste, my friends. Fumbled the ball on the opening moments there with the pre-recorded intro, but hey, practice makes better. There's no such thing as perfect, folks. It just makes you better. Page 89. From The History of God, according to Karen Armstrong, as written by Karen Armstrong. Trying to find where the word logos is so I can just jump to it. But I think I'll just start with, let me back up. Let's just start with page 88. There's a really great intro right here, and I'll just power through the whole motherfucker because I don't give a fuck. Here we go. At the top of page 88, it reads, Jesus had insisted, it's a bold claim, isn't it? Based on Karen Armstrong's research, I am interjecting, she thinks that Jesus had insisted that the, quote, powers, end quote, of God were not for him alone. Okay, we can spend a month unpacking that and talking about that and never get to a resolution. So we'll just put a pin in that and proceed with the page. Controversial statement, right? Jesus had insisted that the powers of God were not for him alone. Paul developed this insight by arguing that Jesus had been the first example of a new type of humanity. Not only had he done everything that the old Israel had failed to achieve, but he had become the new Adam, the new humanity in which all human beings, Goyim included, must somehow participate. And she's got a footnote there, 22. Is that a footnote or a reference? It's notes, and what chapter is this? I don't know. This is, there we go, 22. Romans 12 through 18. Okay. Am I going to dig up Romans 12 through 18 right this second? No, put a pin in it. When we come back through in post, we'll dig up Romans. If I got the reference right, chapter 3, a light for the Gentiles, right? History of God, a light to the Gentiles. Footnote 22, Romans 12 through 18. Okay. Let's go look that up. in post. Continuing from page 88. Again, this is not dissimilar to the Buddhist belief that since all Buddhas had become one with the Absolute, the human ideal was to participate in Buddhahood. In his letter to the church at Philippi, Paul quotes what is generally considered to be a very early Christian hymn, which raises some important issues. He tells his converts that they must have the same self-sacrificing attitude as Jesus. And this is from that letter to the church of Philippi. It's a poem, a hymn, presumably. Who, subsisting in the form of God, did not cling to his equality with God, but emptied himself to assume the condition of a slave, and became as men are, and being as men are, he was humbler yet, even to accepting death on a cross. But God raised him high and gave him the name which is above all names, so that all beings in the heavens, on earth, and in the underworld should bend the knee at the name of Jesus, and at the very tongue should acclaim, Jesus Christ is Lord. Kyrios, to the glory of God, to the Father. 23, that's in Philippians 2, 6 through 11. The hymn seems to... Now, this is Karen Armstrong continuing in her book, right? On page 88, Light to the Gentiles, chapter 3. The hymn seems to reflect a belief among the first Christians that Jesus had enjoyed some kind of prior existence with God before becoming a man in the act of self-emptying, kenosis, by which, like a Bodhisattva, he had decided to share the suffering of the human condition. Paul was too Jewish to accept the idea of Christ existing as a second divine being beside Yahweh from all eternity. The hymn shows that after his exaltation, he is still distinct from and inferior to God, who raises him and confers the title Kyrios upon him. He cannot assume it himself, but is given this title only to the glory of God the Father. Some 40 years later, Karen Armstrong continues, the author of St. John's Gospel, written circa 100, so 100 years after Jesus was born, that author made a similar suggestion. In his prologue, he described the word, and here we find the word of the day, logos, in parentheses, which had been, quote, with God from the beginning, and then had been the agent of creation. Quote, through him all things came to be. Not one thing had its being, but through him. Through. Logos, which had been, quote, with God from the beginning. Now, we could stop there and talk for days. Well, let's power through. The author was not using the Greek word logos in the same way as philo. Quote, he appears to have been more in tune with the Palestinian than the Hellenian Judaism. In the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew scriptures known as the Targums, which were being composed at this time, the term memra, parentheses word, is used to describe God's activity in the world. Let's stop right there. In contemporary postmodern Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, there may or may not be an agreement here. But just from what we've read, one could make the theoretical argument, the theological argument, the theoretical theological argument, that in ye olde ancient times, at some point or another, people understood that God literally and metaphorically spoke/sung the world into existence. Not at some long ago time from forever ago, but now. As an action, as an activity, as an ongoing practice, dare I say. Well, let's see what Karen Armstrong has to say here. The author, she's referring to the author of St. John's Gospel, which is written 100 years after Christ's death. The author was not using the Greek word logos in the same way that Philo, as he appears to have been more in tune with the Palestinian than the Hellenized Judaism. In the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew scriptures, I've already read all that. Memra, the word, used to describe God's activity in the world. Picking back up, it performs the same function as other technical terms like, quote, glory, quote, Holy Spirit, quote, Shekinah, and I would interject here, very quite likely, I don't think she would disagree, quote, Shem. As I've referenced in a previous episode, that word, Shem, is an ancient, and I forget if it's Aramaic or Sumerian or where it comes from, or if it's Hindu, but it means one's soul and higher self in full openness, right? Not in the individualized self, but in the full, like, deep, profound self. Continuing with Karen Armstrong's words. So, Memra, Logos, Holy Spirit, Shekinah all seem to have some common function, which, as she continues, which emphasize the distinction between God's presence in the world and the incomprehensible reality of God itself. Like the divine wisdom, the word, quote, end quote, symbolize God's original plan for creation. When Paul and John spoke about Jesus as though he had some kind of pre-existent life, they were not suggesting that he was a second divine person, in quotes, in the latter Trinitarian use, right? Most everybody today is somewhat familiar with this notion of Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. All three dudes, what is that? Is God gay? Excuse me. One of them has got to be fucking women, right? Or a female, or a yin to the yang, right? But that's a whole nother episode about how they made masculine many aspects of the divine feminine in an effort to erase divine femininity at large from the Bible and from religion at large. But let's get back to Karen Armstrong here. Let's put a pin in that, and we will explore that in a future episode. So he wasn't they're not trying to say that Jesus was a person, that existed separate from God in the way the Trinity might explain it, is what she just finished saying. When Paul, and I'll repeat that sentence in case you doubt that it is correctly, in case you want to rehear it or doubt my take of it. Quoting Karen Armstrong, when Paul and John spoke about Jesus as though he had some kind of pre-existent life, they were not suggesting that he was a second divine person in the latter Trinitarian sense. They were indicating that Jesus had transcended temporal and individual modes of existence because the, quote, power and the, quote, wisdom that he represented, or activities that derived from God, he had in some way expressed, quote, what was there from the beginning. And she's got a reference there. 25. John, 1 John 1:1. Go ahead, go look it up. I'll wait. Continuing. The ideas were comprehensible in a strictly Jewish context, though later Christians with a Greek background would interpret them differently. In the Acts of Apostles, written as late as 100 CE, Common Era, or AD, after death, we can see that the first Christians still had an entirely Jewish conception of God. Now, that's a whole nother episode, which I think I've talked about a little bit in here and in some of the other segments. But please take note that there is no one cohesive idea of God that has always been the most true idea of God. And her work, her research makes that explicitly clear. She points to the places where the people we think of as our ancestors spiritually and religiously and also literally speak of gods in a radically different way than the way in which the preachers in the pulpits today do. And yet they would have you, these postmodern prophets, etc., they would have you believe that they mean the exact same thing as what is said in the ancient words by the ancient peoples. And dare I say, that might be a load of horseshit, my friends. But let's see what Karen Armstrong has to say. Like the divine wisdom, the, quote, word symbolized God's original plan for creation. Creation as an ongoing activity, not a static event that happened X amount of time ago. When Paul, I already read all that. Okay, so let us scan back to where we actually left off. On the Feast of Pentecost, when hundreds of Jews had congregated in Jerusalem from all over the diaspora to celebrate the gift of the Torah on Sinai, the Holy Spirit had descended upon Jesus' companions. They heard, quote, what sounded like a powerful wind from heaven, and something appeared to them that seemed like tongues of fire. And a reference, number 26, Acts of the Apostles 2:2. She's not making this shit up, you guys. Her opinion about what the religious words mean is really quite profound and not something you should dismiss lightly, in my humble opinion. Continuing. The Holy Spirit had manifested itself to these first Jewish Christians as it had to other contemporaries. The Tannaim, Tannaim. Curiously, there's no reference marking there, so we're going to use the dictionary. Immediately, the disciples rushed outside and began preaching to the crowds of Jews and God-fearers from Mesopotamia, Judea, and Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia, and Phrygia, and Pamphylia, and Egypt, and the parts of Libya around Cyrene. Reference number 27, Ibid, in other words, also from Act of the Apostles, I believe, unless there's a book called Ibid, I don't remember that. 2, 9, and 10. To their amazement, everybody heard the disciples preaching in his own language. When Peter rose to address the crowd, he presented this phenomena as the apogee of Judaism. The prophets had foretold the day when God would pour out his Spirit upon mankind so that even women and slaves, even women and slaves, that's brutal, would have visions and dream dreams. Oh, how uplifting. How transcendent. That's referenced as 28 Joel 3, 1 through 5. Go look it up, my friends. My Bible thumping friends. And we're gonna leave this segment here, or this part here, with the end of this paragraph. This day would inaugurate the messianic kingdom when God would live on earth with his people. Peter did not claim that Jesus of Nazareth was God. He, quote, was a man commanded to you by God by the miracles and portents and signs that God worked through him when he was among you. After his cruel death, God had raised him to life and had exalted him to especially high status by God's right hand. The prophets and the psalmists, had all foretold these events. Thus, the whole house of Israel would be certain that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah. Reference 29, Acts of the Apostles 2:22 through 36. This speech appears to have been the message, kerygma, of the earliest Christians. Curiously, that's me interjecting. Continuing, by the end of the 4th century, Christianity had become strong in precisely the places listed above by the authors of Acts. It took root among the Jewish synagogues in the diaspora, which had attracted large numbers of God-fearers or proselytes. Paul's Reformed Judaism appeared to address many of their dilemmas. They also spoke in many tongues, quote unquote, lacking a united voice and coherent position. Many diaspora Jew had come to regard the temple in Jerusalem, drenched as it were in the blood of animals, as a primitive, barbarous institution. The Acts of the Apostles preserves this viewpoint in the story of Stephen, a Hellenistic Jew who had converted to the Jesus sect and was stoned to death by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish governing council, for blasphemy. In his last impassioned speech, Stephen had claimed that the temple was an insult to the nature of God. Quote, the Most High does not live in a home that human hands have built. Reference 30. Ibid, from the Acts of the Apostles, 7:48. Some diaspora Jews adopted the Talmudic Judaism developed by the rabbis after the destruction of the temple. Others found that Christianity answered some of their other queries about the status of the Torah and the universality of Judaism. It was, of course, the universality of Judaism. It was, of course, especially attractive to the God-fearers, which was a term for a group of people that were technically Jewish but not so Jewish, right? As there were many, many variations of what we generically call Jewish faith today, who could become full members of the new Israel without the burden of all 613 mitzvot. Now, let's come back to logos, because that's a whole lot of everything, right? Top of page 89. The author of St. John's Gospel, which was written 100 years after Christ's death, in the prologue, he described the word logos, which had been with God from the beginning and had been the agent of creation. And we see the resounding discussion there about whether or not Jesus was an individual who coexisted with God the way they might teach in the Trinity, or was in fact a facet, some action of God that a human being had had the opportunity to experience phenomenologically within himself. That's a lot to process, right? But let's ask this question. Which version is pushed today, and which version is mocked, ridiculed, marginalized, and even vilified today? There's a bunch of more references to logos, right? As you might recall, because I read them to you at the beginning. I think both part 1 and part 2. But let me find it, just in case I hadn't. Where's that page? Where's the No. There it is. I think, I missed it. I dropped it. Here we go. So, logos. We just read from 89. Now, over here on page 95 and 96, we're going to read about the Gnostics. Oh, I think we already read through parts of 94 of Jesus as incarnation of, but here we go. Here's 94. Oh wait, let's back up a little bit. From page 93, in the middle of the page, how could the Christians explain their faith to the pagan world? ? It seemed to fall between two stools, appearing to be neither a religion in the Roman sense nor a philosophy. Moreover, Christians would have found it hard to list their, quote, beliefs, and may not even have been conscious of evolving a distinctive system of thought. In this, they resembled their pagan neighbors. Their religion had no coherent theology, but could more accurately be described as a carefully cultivated attitude of commitment. This is how she describes really early day Christians. When they recited their, quote, creeds, end quote, creeds has bunny ear quotes, they were not assenting to a set of propositions. The word credere, for example, seems to have derived from cordare, to give one's heart. That does not mean to believe in blindly, does it? No. Although nowadays, if you ask a theologian, what is the creed mean? What does the word creed mean? It means something you agree to or believe. So, as Karen Armstrong continues, when they said credo, quote, credo, exclamation point, or in parentheses she says, or pisteno in Greek, end parentheses, this implied an emotional rather than an intellectual position. That's fascinating. This is her describing early Christians, pre-Roman Catholic Church, before the Catholic Church, right? Thus, Theodore, bishop of Mopsuestia in Cilicia, from 39 to 428, explained to his converts, from 392 AD to 428, Theodore, bishop of Mopsuestia in Cilicia, is quoted as saying, quote, when you say, quote, I engage myself, pisteo, before God, you show that you will remain steadfastly with him, that you will never separate yourself from him, and that you will think it higher than anything else to be and to live with him and to conduct yourself in a way that is in harmony with his commandments. And of course, there's a foot reference there. We're still in the Light of the Gentiles, so page 30, where is that? The footnotes. I lost my footnotes page. I had notes for chapter 3. Light of the Gentiles. What was the number I just read? Number 32. Account given. This is a very long note. Compared to the last couple I've read anyways. Account given by Irenaeus. Heresies 1:1. Most of the writings of the early, quote, heretics were destroyed and survive only in the polemics of their orthodox opponents. Isn't that an interesting thing? That the past is destroyed by whoever wins some petty argument, and then the only recollection of past theories is in the arguments against them by the winners of such wars. But I digress. Let us return. On the bottom of page 93, after that quote, she continues, later Christians would need to give a more theoretical account of their faith and would develop a passion for theological debate that is unique in the history of world religion. We have seen, for example, that there was no official orthodoxy in Judaism. That's a bold statement. Doesn't everybody have orthodoxy? But that ideas about God were essentially private matters. The early Christians would have shared this attitude. During the 2nd century, however, some pagan converts to Christianity tried to reach out to their unbelieving neighbors in order to show that their religion was not a destructive breach with tradition. One of the first of these apologists, and that's where we get that term, people who were converted or joined Christianity and were previously pagans, then realized, oh, hey, you know what? If you look at it just the right way, this Christianity doesn't really get in the way of our ancient traditions. See what now? That's bizarre. And that could be interpreted a bunch of different ways. But let us see what Karen Armstrong is trying to build here. One of the first of these apologists was Justin of Caesarea, a city named after Caesar, I believe, from 100 AD to 165 AD, who died a martyr for the faith. Okay? How many Christians remember this guy? Probably not many. Take a sample. Take a survey. Round up all your favorite Christian friends of whatever variety and ask them, do you remember Justin, the martyr? You know, from Caesarea town. I digress. Here's what Karen Armstrong continues to say. In his restless search for meaning, we can sense the spiritual anxiety of the period. Justin was neither a profound nor brilliant thinker. Before turning to Christianity, he had sat at the feet of a Stoic, a Peripatetic philosopher, and a Pythagorean. Those, for those of you who don't know, they're all different schools of philosophy. And clearly he must have tried to learn from teachers of those schools. So, returning to Karen Armstrong's words, but had clearly failed to understand what was involved in their systems. He lacked the temperament and intelligence for philosophy, but seemed to need more than the worship of cult and ritual. He found his solution in Christianity. Oof. In his two Apologia, from circa 150 or 155 AD, he argued that Christians were simply following Plato, who had also maintained that there was only one God. Both the Greek philosophers and the Jewish prophets had foretold the coming of Christ, an argument which would have impressed the pagans of his day, since there was a fresh enthusiasm for oracles. Interesting. He also argued that Jesus was the incarnation of the Logos. or divine reason, which the Stoics had seen in the order of the cosmos. Full stop. This guy, Justin, who Karen Armstrong judges as not particularly smart, at least according to the philosophers, and that he couldn't fucking get what the fuck they were talking about. Now, I'm not arguing with Karen Armstrong, but does that mean he was stupid? Or does that mean he just didn't fall for the indoctrination of ideological constructs called philosophy? I don't know. But he decided for himself, this dude of ye olde ancient times, of early Christian believers expressing their belief to the world, right? He argued that Jesus was the incarnation of the Logos, or of divine reason, which the Stoics had seen in the order of the cosmos. The Logos had been active in the world throughout history, inspiring Greeks and Hebrews alike, as if there were only ever two people in the world, the Greeks and the Hebrews. But he did not, however, Justin here, he did not, however, explain the implications of this somewhat novel idea. How could a human being incarnate the Logos? ? Was the Logos the same as such biblical images as word or wisdom? ? What was its relation to the one God? ? Justin didn't seem to put forth a lot of detail there, according to Karen Armstrong. Now, she proceeds to describe how, quote, other Christians were developing far more radical theologies. So let's just pause there. What is theology? It is a theoretical, mental, ideological construct about the divine. All right. Now, if there is a nefarious agenda today in our present, my observations leads me to conclude that inherent at the very core, at the very center of the wheels and cogs of that nefarious agenda, that evil system of oppression, one of their strongest tools is using theoretical mental constructs describing the divine to seduce us and distract us away from actually experiencing that which is literally the motherfucking divine thing, separate from our words and ideas of it. Other Christians were developing far more radical theologies, not out of love of speculation for its own sake, but to assuage a profound anxiety. In particular, the Gnostoikoi, Gnostikoi, the knowing ones, turned from philosophy to mythology to explain their acute sense of separation from the divine world. Their myths confronted their ignorance about God and the divine, which they clearly experienced as a source of grief and shame. Basilides, who taught in Alexandria between 130 and 160 AD, and his contemporary Valentinus, St. Valentine, there he is, who left Egypt to teach in Rome, both acquired a huge following and showed that many of the people who converted to Christianity felt lost adrift and radically displaced. Something changed. Right here on page 94. Let's stop and unpack some shit. Why would a group of people who joined a spiritual system that was convincing enough to seduce them into joining then feel lost and separated and split off from divinity. When just 100 and some odd years ago, prior, the teacher was teaching practices that in theory guided individuals to a deeper, more profoundly connected sense of communion with that which we call the divine thing, that which we call God, that which we call mother or father or whatever. Interesting, right? Profoundly interesting. That in just 100 short years from the direct guidance of the enlightened one or whatnot, whatever he was, Jesus. Let's see what she's got to say. The Gnostics all began with an utterly incomprehensible reality which they called the Godhead, since it was the source of the lesser being that we call God. There was nothing at all that we could say about it, since it entirely eludes the grasp of our limited minds. As Valentinus explained, the Godhead was, quote, perfect and pre-existent, dwelling in invisible and unnameable heights. This is the pre-beginning and the forefather and depth. It is uncontainable and invisible, eternal and ungenerated, is quiet and deep solitude for infinite aeons. With it was thought, which is also called grace and silence. Footnote reference 33. For Light of the Gentiles. 33. Account given by Irenaeus Heresies 111. Most of the writings of the early heretics were destroyed and survive only by the polemics of their orthodox opponents. I've already read that footnote. Is that the right footnote for this? Yeah. 33. So, she continues, men have always speculated about this absolute, but none of their explanations have been adequate. It is impossible to describe the Godhead, which is neither good nor evil, and cannot even be said to, quote, exist. Basilides taught that in the beginning there had been not God, but only the Godhead, which, strictly speaking, was capital N, nothing, because it did not exist in any sense that we can understand. Foot reference number 34. That's from Hippolytus Heresies 7:21-4. Karen Armstrong continues, but this nothingness had wished to make itself known and was not content to remain alone in depth and silence. There was inner revolution in the depths of its unfathomable being, which resulted in a series of emanations similar to those described in the ancient pagan mythologies. The first of these emanations was the, quote, God, which we know and pray to, yet even, quote, God was inaccessible to us and needed further elucidation. Consequently, new emanations proceeded from God in pairs. What? Yin and yang? Up and down? Left and right? Light and dark? That's my interjection, right? Consequently, Karen Armstrong says, new emanations proceeded from God in pairs, each of which expressed one of his, and or her, I'm interjecting, divine attributes. Quote, God lay beyond gender, but as in the Enua Elish, Each pair of emanations consisted of male and female, a scheme which attempted to neutralize the masculine tenor of more conventional monotheism. Ooh, there's a whole episode right there, right? Monotheism, anti-monotheism, and paganism. Each pair of emanations, but put a pin in that. We'll continue with Karen Armstrong right here, page 95, A Light to the Gentiles, talking about Logos and how it is a manifestation of the divine, a function of the divine, a very singing out of the divine, right? Each pair of emanations grew weaker and more attenuated since they were getting even further from their divine source. Finally, when 30 such emanations or aeons had emerged, the process stopped and the divine world, the pleroma, was complete. The Gnostics were not proposing an entirely outrageous cosmology, since everybody, in the time frame that Karen Armstrong's referring to, everybody believed that the cosmos was teeming with such aeons, demons, and spiritual powers. St. Paul had referred to thrones, dominations, sovereignties, and powers. St. Paul, from the Christian tradition, while the philosophers had believed that these invisible powers were the ancient gods and made them intermediaries between man and the one, capital O. She continues to describe that there had been a There had been a catastrophe, a primal fall, which the Gnostics described in various ways. Some said that Sophia, parentheses, capital W, wisdom, the last of the emanations, fell from grace because she aspired to a forbidden knowledge of the inaccessible Godhead. Because of her overweening presumption, she had fallen from the pleroma, and her grief and distress had formed the world of matter. Exiled and lost, Sophia had wandered through the cosmos, yearning to return to the divine source. This amalgam of Oriental and pagan ideas expressed the Gnostics, and mind you, the Gnostics were Christians. Don't forget that, folks. Expressed the Gnostics' profound sense that our world was in some sense a perversion of the celestial, born of ignorance and dislocation. Other Gnostics taught that the, quote, God had not created the material world, since he could have had nothing to do with base matter. This had been the work of one of the aeons, which they called the Demiurgos, or capital C, Creator. He had become envious of, quote, God, end quote, and aspired to be the center of the pleroma. Consequently, he fell and had created the world in a fit of defiance. As Valentinus explained, he had made heaven without knowledge, formed man in ignorance of man, had brought earth to light without understanding earth. Reference 35. Irenaeus Heresies 153. But the Logos, capital L Logos this time, in other places it has been lowercase l Logos, but the Logos, capital L, another of the aeons, had come to the rescue and descended to earth assuming the physical appearance of Jesus, or as I prefer, Yeshua Christos, in order to teach men and women, and by the way, it should be the appearance of Yeshua Christos and Mary Magdalene. I'm sure she didn't mean, she's quoting from this dude's probably slightly biased expression as opposed to her own understanding in which the two of them were, in fact, these two things equally and together. But continuing. The Logos, another of the aeons, had come to the rescue and descended to earth, assuming the physical appearance of Jesus in order to teach men and women the way back to God. Eventually, this type of Christianity would be suppressed. Stop right there. Page 96, The History of God, A Light to the Gentiles. This type of Christianity would be suppressed. But we shall see that centuries later, Jews, Christians, and Muslims would return to this type of mythology, finding that it expressed their religious experience of, quote, God, more accurately than Orthodox theology. Period. Stop. Fascinating, right? I've been rambling on for part 2 for quite a bit longer than I meant to, but I couldn't help myself. I'm going to wrap it up with this next bit. The myths were never intended as literal accounts of creation and salvation. They were symbolic expressions of an inner truth, quote, God, end quote, and the pleroma were not external realities, quote, out there, end quote, but were to be found within. And here's a quote that she makes. She quotes 36 from Hippolytus Hereses 8151, 1 through 2. Abandon the search for God and the creation and other matters of similar sort. Look for him by taking yourself as the starting point. This is from Hippolytus, Heresy 721-4. And these are Christians, not evil pagans, not insidious others who are trying to corrupt Christianity. These are earnest, sincere Christians that, as Karen Armstrong's research points out, were earnestly having a rigorous dialogue using logos in the other way, in the philosophical way, about what the meanings behind the teachings of Jesus and Mary were about. Okay? Abandon the search for God and the creation and other matters of similar sort. Look for him by taking yourself as the starting point. Learn who it is within you, makes everything his own, and says, my God, my mind, my thought, my soul, my body. Learn the sources of sorrow, joy, love, hate. Learn how it happens that one watches without willing, loves without willing. If you carefully investigate these matters, you will find him in yourself. 36. Hippolytus, Hereses 8:15, 1 through 2. The pleroma represented a map of the soul. This is Karen Armstrong continuing. And interpreting all that which she's just referenced. The divine light could be discerned even in this dark world if the Gnostic knew where to look. During the primal fall of either Sophia or the Demiurge, some divine sparks had also fallen from the pleroma and had been trapped in matter. The Gnostic would find a divine spark in his own soul, could become aware of a divine element within himself, which would help him find his way home. The Gnostics showed that many of the new converts to Christianity were not satisfied with the traditional idea of God which they had inherited from Judaism. They did not experience the world as, quote, good, the work of a benevolent deity. A similar dualism and dislocation marked the doctrine of Marcion in 100 to 165, who founded his own rival church in Rome and attracted a huge following. Jesus had said that a sound tree produced good fruit. Reference 37. Luke 6:43. Go look it up. A sound tree produced good fruit. How could the world have been created by a good God when it was manifestly full of evil and pain? Question mark. Marcion was, or Marcion, I don't know which way it should be pronounced correctly. It's Marcion. She just referenced him, the guy that had a big rival following in Rome during 100 through 165 AD. Marcion was also appalled by the Jewish scriptures, which seemed to describe a harsh, cruel God who exterminated whole populations in his passion for justice. I've talked about this before, right? Like the tinkering and the corruption of the holy words, the holy books, the holy ideas, the divine stories did not begin recently, folks. The Jews themselves already had a problem of deep, messed up, that those that we call the ancient Hebrewic Jews, the people here referenced, that had many splinter groups within them, as I keep referencing Monty Python and the life of Brian. They had to do a lovely bit, a recurring gag about the various different splinter cells within that which we might call the Jews of Judea at the time. My point is, none of what we get spoon-fed today is very accurate. And none of what was going on back then is in any way, shape, or form as flat and simple and silly as they might have you believe today. I wonder why that is. But let's wrap up this section, because I've really been rambling on for quite a bit. Marcion, also appalled by the Jewish scriptures, justice, blah, blah, he decided that it was this Jewish God who was, quote, lustful for war, inconstant in his attitudes, and self-contradictory, end quote, reference 38 in Irenaeus' Heresies 1:27-2, who had created the world. But Jesus had revealed that another God existed, who had never been mentioned by the Jewish scriptures. This second God was, quote, placid and mild and simply good and excellent, end quote. Reference 39 from Tertullian against Marcion 161. And excellent. He was entirely different from the cruel, juridical creator of the world. We should therefore turn away from the world, which, since it was not his doing, could tell us nothing about this benevolent deity, and should also reject, quote, the, quote, Old Testament, concentrating simply upon those New Testament books which had been preserved by the Spirit of Jesus. The popularity of Marcion's or Marcion's teachings showed that he had voiced a common anxiety. Let's put a pin in that idea. Karen Armstrong addresses this early on, and I'll come around full circle someday to talk about it, or maybe already have in a previous episode. She openly talks about how the reason she thinks religion constantly changes and is changed, even though we are told and lied to and said that it is this monolithic, consistent, self-consistent, constant thing. It changes because we fuck with it to deal with our fears, and that only a religion that functions functionally in our immediate modern context, in other words, whatever given time in history, if the religion helped us cope with our fears, then we kept those changes, and if it didn't, we adapted away from those. And thus, even without trying, we have corrupted the teachings and the guidance of those who actually spoke them. But I digress. A really great critique of that war-loving God of the Old Testament. She continues to wrap up about this guy. At one time, it seemed as though he were about to found a separate church, this Marcion. He had put his finger on something important in the Christian experience. Generations of Christians have found it difficult to relate positively to the material world, and there are still a significant number who do not know what to make of the Hebrew God. All right, I digress. I'm going to pause it here for another quick break to ease my throat, and we're going to come back because we're going to power through all the references of Logos in Karen Armstrong's book, because I think there might be something to it, folks. So stay tuned. We're going to be jumping ahead, I believe, to the next chapter, chapter 4, Trinity, the Christian God. And somewhere in page 108, 109, there is a reference to the Logos. And we'll see how these things we call religions constantly evolve, are changed, are edited, and are critiquing themselves for allowing corruption to creep in.